Hello, everybody. We are getting ready to start chapter 3, which is going to be at least a three-part lecture. So we're going to break this chapter up a little bit differently than you'll find it in your textbook because I want to spend a little bit more time on the different types of bacteria that we're going to find in foods and more time on food safety because as we go through this chapter, we have to remember all these things throughout the labs that we do throughout this semester. So we have 16 labs that we're going to be doing, and you're going to be cooking, and you're going to be using your hands, and you're going to be using equipment. And we have to make sure that that equipment is clean, that the foods are cooked to the correct temperature, that they're cooled to the correct temperature, so that we don't then sample the food and get sick from these foods, which is why it's really important that we're very careful when we're cooking in lab just to protect ourselves and protect our classmates. So we'll talk a lot about temperature control in this chapter. We're going to talk about the specific things that can contaminate food that can give us an illness and what types of regulations there currently are to protect our food supply. So you may have heard some things in the news recently. The most recent one that came out and is not on this slide is the Bluebell ice cream that was contaminated. And there are constantly things that come out. I'm on a listserv for the FDA, and there's food contaminants that come out daily on that. Just, all from ranging from bacteria to molds to viruses to non-food contaminants like metal shavings, so there's lots of things that contaminate our foods, and a lot of them make us sick. And for the most part, when you think you have the stomach flu, what you probably really have is some sort of foodborne illness. But all of the numbers we have about how many outbreaks come from things like E. coli or staph or salmonella, they come because people have gone to the hospital and the physicians have tested the diarrhea or they've tested the blood to see what the bacteria is. But every time you get the stomach flu, you don't just go to the hospital and get that stuff checked. So there are a lot more cases of foodborne illnesses that occur daily that we just don't have record of because people think it's a stomach flu. So we'll talk a lot about some of the symptoms that you're going to have. These that are on this introductory slide are just some recent outbreaks, just to give you an example of things that are out there. Now this one, you'll see the E. coli O157H7. If you've ever seen the documentary Food Inc., they talk a lot about this bacteria, and it's a little bit worse than the regular E. coli bacteria because it is such a aggressive type of bacteria. And unfortunately, if people get infected with this, they not only get the nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, but they also tend to get things like kidney failure, which is really something that can put somebody on or have somebody die from this infection. So in 2011, the Food Modernization Act came out to be a little bit more stringent about how we're regulating our food to keep food supply safe for people. And when they did this, they increased the frequency of food inspections. And so the FDA wanted more enforcement. They wanted more power to make inspections and to keep our food safe. So that's kind of how this was pushed through. There typically has to be a third party kind of surveyor or auditor for any foods that are imported. So with our global food, we can go to the grocery store and we can get food from Russia, we can get food from Mexico and Italy, where before it wasn't well regulated, now it's much better regulated. And another part of this act is that we can trace and we can look back at foods that have kind of common infections that we see. So it allows more tracking for foods, especially high-risk foods that are going to come in contact with some sort of contaminant like meats. So some of the food contaminants that we'll talk about in this class, and again, if you're following along in your book, this is a little bit out of order just to try to get it in just kind of some sort of organized slideshow. If you ever eat fish, or if you've ever been living on the East Coast, you may have heard of something called red tide. And this is something that we don't really deal with much in our area because we don't have fresh sea fish. We have fresh river fish, but we don't really have sea fish. And so during the summer months and early fall, you get kind of this reddish color on the ocean water, and they call that red tide. But what it actually is a organism that the shellfish eat. That's their kind of preferred food source, but you can't ingest it. And so if you were to go shellfish hunting or fishing, and you were to consume this shellfish during the time when the red tide season is occurring, then you can actually get that organism into your body, and it can cause food poisoning or a cytotoxin, which can cause significant I'm trying to think of a good word, but symptoms, for lack of a better word, that could eventually lead to death. And it really depends on the quantity. So it depends on, I guess, how many shellfish you've eaten, how much red tide that shellfish has eaten. So really, you should avoid eating foods during that time. Now, most people in those local areas don't fish during those time of the months, or they avoid shellfish because of the potential poisoning that can occur. But there's also ways that commercial fish canneries can do chemical tests, and they can decrease the amount of shellfish that come in contact. So they may keep them in like a secluded area where they can grow until they're big enough to, or kind of like a hatchery, to keep those shellfish safe. And so there's a picture a little bit with some color added to it to give you an idea of what that organism looks like. And it's not a bacteria, it is a one-celled organism. Other contamination that you can find in fish is mercury, which most of you have probably heard of this. This is why if you took the maternal and infant class or the life cycle nutrition class, you talked about, during pregnancy, women shouldn't have more than 2 servings, maybe 3 servings of fish a week because of the chance of mercury. And the levels of mercury in fish is a little bit questionable. There is higher levels in more predator fish than in those fish that just eat plants. So they do kind of warn against some of the higher predator fish. And if you Google image, you can find lots of different charts that have fishes that are of lower mercury poisoning and those that are of higher mercury poisoning. A high risk food might be something like a tuna or a swordfish or a sea bass. Something low on the sheet might be catfish or carp. Although carp, I think, is actually middle line. But regardless, it is something that is of concern, and it's something to be watchful of. But again, if you only are eating 2 to 3 servings of fish a week, there is no risk of mercury poisoning in those cases. The other thing you have to be careful of with fish, ocean or freshwater fish, local fish, is that they're very susceptible to spoilage. And one of the things that you have to be very diligent of, and we'll talk about this later on in the chapter, is what the fish looks like when you purchase it. It has to stay cold. If you ever go to the grocery store and you see the fish on ice, you should probably take warning or take note of what that fish looks like, because it may not have been kept cold long enough. If you're out fishing, catfishing or bluegill fishing, you want to use that fish within 1 to 2 days. It really does not keep longer than that. Now, if you froze it, you can keep it a lot longer. But spoiled fish will typically have really cloudy eyes. Their gills will look not so shiny. They may have blood around their gills. So if you see anything like that, you should turn around and walk away. Now I want to spend just a few minutes on food additives, and I'll take you to a website for those of you who are interested. You can dig around for more information here. But food additives are typically things, when we're talking about food additives, we're talking about things that have been added on purpose, okay? So it's not accidentally fallen into the food. It's not like a fingernail or a hair. Or one time I went to a restaurant and there was a worm in my salad. Okay, that's not an additive. That's an accidental contaminant. So a food additive is typically by intent. It can be by accident, although that's usually not an additive, so to speak, as far as adding something to the food. It's typically a contaminant. These are supposedly, and this is a little bit of my bias here, supposedly regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And it's been regulated like that since 1958. And again, I won't get on my soapbox right now, but I'd be more than happy to get on it in class if that's something that you want to talk about. The GRAS list. GRAS stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. So what the FDA is saying is that so far there have not been any deaths from the additive. Well, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been, attention deficit disorders or, strokes or migraines. It just means that they're recognized as safe and they're probably not going to kill you. And it probably isn't going to cause cancer. Yeah, I'll move on before I get on to something here. Now, the Delaney cause requires, is part of this amendment that requires that the additive not be permitted. And so if there is proof that, an additive causes cancer or is harmful, then it must be removed from the marketplace or from that food. So additives are typically used to extend shelf life, to add color, flavor, different textures, and may help control the pH, which may be helping to control the temperature. It may help to leaven the food, which means give it some volume. It may help in food preparation or to add nutritional value, things like vitamins and minerals that may be added. So there's lots of different uses. There are several different categories. Now you can see these in your book on page 49. There's 1 through 32. And I'm not going to list all of those, but I do suggest that you look at them and see how many different types of food additives that there are. And they're technically supposed to be on the label, although they're in such, obscure terms that sometimes you're not really sure what those things are. But they should be on the label as far as, each of those 32 different categories. Now, incidental contaminants are things that we didn't mean to get in there. Those are the accidental additives that they talked about at the beginning of this section. So it could be anything from insects or if you've ever heard the, I don't know if it's a true statement or not, about somebody finding a mouse inside of an aluminum can of Dr. Pepper, and whether or not that's true or not, I'm not sure. But anytime that there's something else inside the food that should not be there, then that is considered an incidental or basically accidental contaminant. Other food undesirables, that would be, if you've ever bought a can of green beans and you get a stem. Well, that's annoying. It's not going to hurt you. It's just annoying. So that would be a food undesirable. Now, this is the website I wanted to direct you to. And as I mentioned, if this is something that interests you, I highly recommend that you dig deep and kind of look into this website. But there's lots of different categories, and I'm going to go over to the food safety and food additives. And this lists every single additive that you could find in foods, and it lists them based on alphabetical order, but then it categorizes them as avoid these foods, be careful with these additives, or cut back. So you can see there's hundreds upon hundreds of these. Some of these you've probably heard of, some of you haven't. Things like aspartame, which is something that, of course, we don't take it out because the FDA thinks it's fine, but is found in, sugar-free foods. So anyway, it has a category of you should avoid on it. If I can scroll up, there you go. So anyway, you can dig deeper into this website if it interests you. I highly recommend that you do it. If not, then, you can always, go look at other types of food additives in other sections. So we will stop here and pick up next on the different types of microorganisms.